Thank you. Just climbed down from my pedestal. Well, Julian and I go back a little way in these issues. I first started teaching refugee law 10 years ago, soon after, or actually coinciding with the Tampa incident, and Julian and many others were very keen to come out to Monash and talk to us in those days. So those were very, very heady days. But the reason I got involved in refugee law is interesting. I was teaching administrative law and just found that there were so many cases to do with refugees where refugees were being dealt with differently. And I started off writing a little article about the Refugee Review Tribunal, and to my surprise, I found that I was suddenly notorious, that Philip Ruddock had apparently spluttered over a cocktail drink. And so I went off, being a good girl from Adelaide, by the way, that explains an awful lot. I went off to see a principal member of the tribunal and said, I hear you weren't very happy with what I wrote. Perhaps we could work together and improve things. I was instead given a lecture. This happened not once, but twice. And as each of the principal members actually subsequently deceased, I decided to move from looking at procedural issues to looking more at substantive issues of refugee law. But that was actually quite a chilling encounter. It showed how sensitive the issue was to the Australian government. And I loved Adam's rule of law theme. I have written a book about the rule of law, and which is really, in a very sustained way, a pun on the use of Philip Ruddock's word integrity, to show just how much lack of integrity there is, in fact, in the Australian system in particular, and how to what sustained and targeted lengths the government has gone to keep asylum seekers out of the picture, out of the rule of law, despite the High Court recently saying that you just can't do it. So what I thought I could do today is just add a little bit of a global perspective to the issue, and in fact take up some of the themes. I enjoyed Adam's talk very much, giving this sort of overview of the rule of law and how human rights came about. I'm concurrently writing a book about trafficking, human trafficking at the moment, and tracking the history of that and how the whole agenda came just to focus on particular issues, and you can see how the issues are all interconnected. So I thought I'd just share a few thoughts with you in a very brief amount of time, because I realise I'm on a time constraint, about refugees. So here is, first of all, we hope, a global snapshot. So this is how the world looks today. There are a number of people on the move, and mostly they are moving because they want to work. Refugees are just one category of international migrants who are often considered to be privileged. But have a look at those figures from 1970 to 2000, how they've moved and how they keep going up. We have a very unsatisfactory convention on migrant workers. Nobody wants to recognise them, and nobody really wants to know about the ILO's work on this issue. So refugees are just a very small part of that. Here we are. So, but refugees themselves are all also faring badly within the whole category of forced migrants. We can call them loosely forced migrants. They are becoming, within that category of forced migrants, actually people who are very much the pariahs. Instead of refugees, we have more and more stateless people. We have more and more internally displaced people, because states simply don't want to recognise refugees. Refugees have an international protections regime because they're considered to be part of the international problem, because they've crossed a border. So what are states doing? They're simply putting up the shutters and pushing people into areas within the same country. So asylum applications are actually going down. So that's the global picture. Have a look at who are actually signatories to the convention. So this is a very sad situation when you see how many countries actually are signatories to the convention. Those are all the people who are white. So we are white, as we know. But look at that green one there in the middle on the left. Who is that? The USA. The USA is not a signatory to the Refugees Convention, and quite a lot of other international conventions, in fact. So that tells you something about it. So that's what I've already told you, that refugees are basically being contained. They are very much a pariah category today. Protracted refugee situations is a new term that the UNHCR has created to explain these refugees who just simply remain and remain and remain. And look who they are. Unsurprisingly, they're from situations where there is conflicts created by whom? By which governments are supporting them, and which governments are refusing to take these people when they do flee and seek safety. So I could give you a snapshot of our region, but it's probably going to take a little time to bring up the web page, but we could try. Should we try? It's actually very interesting to see just how few asylum seekers there actually are in Indonesia and how many more there are in the rest of Asia. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just refer you to it because it's a fantastic website that is done by the UNHCR, and it just shows you how there are hundreds of thousands of refugees in other countries around the region. There are far greater problems in Malaysia than there are in Indonesia. Indonesia is quite mild and welcoming compared to Malaysia. Thailand regards asylum seekers as a matter of royal prerogative. The issues are the thinking on the issues is just so far removed from the way that they should be thought about. So in some ways, Australia is the only place in the region which can deal with these issues. So how is Australia dealing with them? Well, they have a regional cooperation model with Indonesia, which has been going on since about 2001. And they also provide money to the UNHCR and to IOM to work with refugees in Indonesia, and then they try and make sure that as few as possible actually get to Australia. So a recent study shows that actually Australia only takes about 30% of the refugees. So this is the way that we are fulfilling our obligations under the Refugee Convention. There was a further agreement in October 2010, and there have been further discussions since then. We keep hearing little snippets, but the emphasis is all on the sorts of issues that Julian mentioned, namely irregular migrants, catching people smugglers, setting up shelters and detention centres. Australia is funding detention centres. I was in Singapore last year. There's an island called Bintan where people go for holidays, and they also have an Australian-funded refugee asylum seeker processing centre. It always surprises me how many islands there are around the world, Lampedusa, Bali, Bintan, where you had this coincidence of tourists and asylum seekers. Tourists are allowed to move, they can go wherever they like. Asylum seekers who are simply exercising their right to seek asylum, their right to freedom of movement, are treated quite differently. So we have a very unfair and unjust situation. So how are asylum seekers dealt with in relation to Indonesia through the Bali process? Now, I do want you to have a look at that website yourself at some stage if you haven't. You can see that the full title of the process I've put there deliberately. It's the process on people smuggling, trafficking and related transnational crime. That is the way the issues are characterised. That is why we have the emphasis in human trafficking as in refugee issues on transnational crime and people smugglers. Because in the 1970s, when people actually started moving because they needed to, and because they wanted to, and because they could, all those reasons which are often called globalisation, the governments of the developed states simply put up the shutters. So there's a description, far too long, far too many words, but just again to give you the idea of what the focus of the Bali process is. And as I say, look at the website. It contains a lot of pictures of well-dressed, well-fed officials in empty rooms talking to each other, because this process is actually organised through the IOM, the International Organisation of Migration, which basically gets governments to talk to themselves. So that is what it is. So what are the prospects for a regional processing centre or framework under the Bali process? oh, the page is blank. The page is deliberately blank. So solutions, this is where I actually get really depressed. Solutions, 10 years now, I've been talking about these issues. We're now seeing patterns of behaviour. Julian's just reminded us of some. What do? We have to do better than we are. It looked as if we were doing really well, and I really don't know what has gone wrong, but someone has to get out there and agitate and make the public understand that these politicians are just playing with us. Both sides are playing with us, and it just isn't fair to these people who are, for the most part, decent people who leave because they've got the initiative to leave, who are being treated in total disrespect of their rights and dignity, and who are reacting in a perfectly human way. So I'll finish on that note.